Thank you everyone for joining the Article 3 project today for a series of discussions with key leaders in the fight to confirm President Trump's judicial nominees. Our guest today is Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa, the former and future chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Unfortunately for Senator Grassley, he was my boss last Congress when I served as one of his aides to assist him with nominations. But fortunately for me, Senator Grassley was unquestionably my best boss. But please don't tell Justice Gorsuch that. Before I introduce Senator Grassley, please allow me a minute to talk about the Article 3 project. We launched A3P a year ago when we saw that the Democrats and their allies in the media were never going to stop their unrelenting, bogus attacks on Justice Kavanaugh, a very good man. At A3P, we fight to help confirm President Trump's judicial nominees, punch back against the left's attacks on sitting judges like Justice Kavanaugh, defend the Senate confirmation process, and fight back against the left's assaults on judicial independence through their unconstitutional or otherwise radical court packing, term limits, and even impeachment schemes. We are preparing for the next Supreme Court fight, which will make the Kavanaugh confirmation look like a walk in the park. Now let me introduce Senator Grassley. Senator Grassley was sworn in as the Senate President pro tempore for the 116th Congress, which places him third in the presidential line of succession. He leverages his seniority in the United States Senate to build bipartisan coalitions and advance a conservative agenda to improve opportunity and prosperity for more Americans. As the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Grassley continues vigorous congressional oversight of the executive branch to make sure the federal government does its job. He is also building upon his longstanding record to work across the aisle to solve problems. Specifically, Chairman Grassley has announced his list of priorities priorities to improve the lives of Americans through better trade, healthcare, and tax policies. During his 4-year chairmanship of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Grassley shepherded a historic 85 federal judges, including 2 Supreme Court justices, an all-time record 30 judges to the critically important basic consent authority for lifetime appointments to the federal bench. He also held hearings and readied for confirmation votes another 50 judicial nominees, 6 more circuit judges for his successor. His signature legislative achievement as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee was landmark bipartisan criminal justice reform called the First Step Act. It passed the Senate 87-12 and was signed into law in December 2018. Pretty impressive work from this farmer from Iowa. Thank you, Senator, for joining us today.
Well, I'm glad to join you, and I want to thank you for the work you're doing to make sure that we have only strict constructionists on the court. And before you ask your first question, you brought up about future Supreme Court positions. And one of the things that I like about President Trump is he's the first president that said, before he was elected, from a list of people, he was going to pick these sort of strict constructionists to be on the Supreme Court. And he did that in Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. And I'm sure he'll do it in the future. And 20% of the people that voted for him said they voted for him because of the type of people he was going to put on the Supreme Court. And most presidents run on a platform, they don't stand on a platform. I think we ought to compliment this president for standing on the platform he does. And when he's reelected, your work will help continue the efforts that he's made to change the court for the next 30 or 40 years.
Agree wholeheartedly, Senator. So let's turn to these questions. I know you are back in Washington now, but tell us, what's it been like being quarantined at the Grassley farm back in Iowa?
5 weeks on the farm, doing very little farm work because I got family, grandchildren that do most of it, and they don't really care to have grandpas around watching. But I was able to do an awful lot around the buildings But I was able to conduct every Senate business I would normally conduct if I was here, only I did it by email or text or telephone, and was busy at that. But the one thing about 5 weeks being isolated on the farm, and by the way, I didn't go to any town except one day before I returned to Washington. But I learned, and the reason I say this is because I know you know, Mike, but when I go home every weekend, and my wife doesn't often go home with me, but she was with me these 5 weeks, and just constantly together. And I think I found out that our marriage of 65 years will survive.
Did Barbara, did she keep you on task during those 5 weeks?
She, not as much as you would think, because she was making sure that I did my business as a senator. She didn't interrupt that very much.
That's good. So I've heard you tell this story before, but how and when did you first get appointed to the Senate Judiciary Committee?
My first week in the United States Senate, Senator Strom Thurmond, who had, I guess, never been a chairman of a committee in the 20-some years that he'd been in the Senate by that time, and he wanted to make sure that he had a conservative committee, and he wanted to keep a lot of liberal Republicans off. He couldn't do anything about the Democrats, but he wanted to keep liberal Republicans off. So they sought me and a couple other non-lawyers out to serve on the committee, and I said, I can't serve on the committee. I'm not a lawyer. He says, don't worry about that. We'll give you enough resources so you can hire good lawyers. So I took the Judiciary Committee in January of 1981 and been on it ever since. And I'm proud to have been a member of that committee for that length of time. And I'm glad that Strom Thurmond sought me out.
Let's talk about judicial confirmations. When people hear about President Trump's record-shattering success with confirming conservative judges to the bench, they usually give credit to Senator McConnell and former White House counsel Don McGahn. Both were very important to this judicial project. But I don't think people realize just how critical you have been to the transformation of the federal judiciary for President Trump and conservatives. The Senate Judiciary Committee does the heavy lifting on these nominees. As chairman, you did 95% of the work, while others took 100% of the credit. Under your leadership, the Senate confirmed 2 Supreme Court justices and an all-time record 30 judges to the critically important federal appellate courts, the last stop for over 99% of all federal appeals. You also led the effort to confirm 53 district court judges and the leadership at the Justice Department, along with readying for your successor 50 more judicial nominees, including 6 more circuit judges. What are some of the steps you took to ensure this success?
Well, I did it by keeping the schedule regular, very regular, with hearings and business meetings. It was very important to keep up the flow of nominees once they got out of the White House, to have about an average of, I think, 28 days in our committee for proper vetting, and move them to the floor to keep up the flow of the nominees to the floor. My staff worked hard, and because we had these regular hearings, very regular hearings, the committee was never a bottleneck then. And in fact, the Senate floor became kind of a slowdown of the whole process. Even after the Kavanaugh confirmations, during my last few weeks as chairman of the committee, we kept up the pace to such an extent that the Senate was voting on nominees after I proceeded to be chairman of the Finance Committee, and that went on for probably 5 or 6 months last year.
Let's talk about the blue slip process. And for people who don't understand that, that is literally a blue piece of paper that the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman sends to home state senators that started over 100 years ago, before we had FBI full field background investigations and other ways to vet these nominees. It was a way to make sure that these judicial nominees weren't scoundrels. And since the Democrats nuked the judicial filibuster in 2013 to push through President Obama's nominees to the DC Circuit, the Democrats seem to have had buyer's remorse with the blue slip, and they went from not wanting 41 senators to be able to block a judicial nominee to one home state senator being able to block a circuit court nominee. So let's talk about that. Can you talk about how you go? I'm sorry, Senator, go ahead.
Oh, no, go finish your question.
I was going to say, can you talk about how you returned the blue slip process to its historic function for circuit judges and how that has affected the confirmation of judges?
Yeah, I can. First of all, the blue slip started, I think, 102 years ago by whoever was chairman of the committee at that particular time. And it probably only reached real use till about the 1950s in a very structured way, like it was used until recently. But the reason the blue slip had to change a little bit is because the Democrats eliminated filibusters for nominees to the courts. So everything debate can be stopped with 51 votes. It's just natural that home state senators, historically it's been this way, get a significant say in the nomination for seats in their states, especially for district vacancies. Now, during the Bush administration, my colleague, Senator Leahy, was chairman. He decided that he would allow blue slips to become a veto, preventing many nominees from getting confirmed. Only one other chairman of the 19 previous chairmen of the committee in these 102 years was Eastland, a Democrat for Mississippi, that made the blue slip return. If it wasn't returned, then that became a veto. And that was because he wanted to block nominees who agreed with the Brown versus Board of Education decision. He didn't want those type of people to get to be judges. So after some abuse of the consultation process, in 2017, I began enforcing the historical policy of the blue slip. Home state senators would need to be consulted by the White House on circuit court nominees, but the blue slip could not be a veto for it. And that's different than the way I handled it for district court judges. And the difference was that a district court judge operates just within a single state, where circuit court judges operate in circuits of several states. And so a senator holding up a nominee in his state, even though it was his own state or her own state, it ended up that would affect the workload of all the other judges from the other states. So as long as there was proper consultation with the senators and we didn't get the blue slip returned, then I made sure that nominee could go ahead, because I didn't think it was right for the blue slip to be a veto just for political reasons. And the bottom line of that basically is that the blue slip could be used before, when we had the filibuster of 60 votes, but once the Democrats eliminated that, that made the blue slip a veto, where before that it wasn't significant and there weren't very many blue slips not returned.
One event many people forget is how you decided to wait on holding a hearing for Justice Scalia's successor until after the presidential election. Had you held a hearing, we may not have Justice Gorsuch today. The Democrats would have likely had the momentum to fill the slot if you decided to move forward with the nominations hearing. Can you talk about your decision and what it was like running for re-election during the Garland nomination?
Yeah. Well, if people think today is a critically partisan time, it was especially partisan at that time in the state of Iowa because I was up for re-election. And you know how I do my 99 county meetings every year, where I have a Q&A with constituents and let them set the agenda in each of the 99 counties. So Harry Reid was majority leader at that time, not only giving speeches on the Senate floor of why Grassley was wrong for holding it up, but he also had billboards in Iowa, and he even had mobile billboards that came around to my county meetings. At some of the town meetings, my staff noted that about half of the license plates were from out of state, so meaning that the Democrats protesters were lining up because I was holding up this nomination. And I still think that Judge Garland is a good person and very respectable jurist, but it was the right decision to follow the Biden rule, which said in the presidential election year, you shouldn't move a judge forward, let the new president or a re-elected president fill that vacancy. So I was operating under the Biden rule. So Biden's a Democrat. He established this rule in the 1980s. It was repeated in the 1990s, and Schumer picked it up in the early 2000s. And it was always a Democrat complaining about a Republican president. You couldn't. So I concluded you can't have one rule for Democrat president and a different rule for Republican president. That's why I held it up under the Biden rule. But we had a few members on and off the committee who disagreed. We'll never know, but I think that I held a hearing. If I had held a hearing, that I think it would have been very difficult to stop the nomination on the floor. So that's how Gorsuch got on the Supreme Court.
You were the most critical player in the Kavanaugh confirmation process. As the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, you successfully shepherded him through the most contentious confirmation in our history. I saw just how hard you worked and how fair you were when I served as one of your aides. What was that like for you chairing that process?
Well, I had a chance to invoke my own advice to other people who are chairman of committees, because I always say either you run the committee or the committee runs you. And the first day of that hearing, the Democrats just tried to pass motions or offer motions to adjourn. They were going to rattle me. We were going to shut the committee down. That's what they were trying to do. So we went through 2 hours of kind of these motions, and I kept saying, this is a hearing. This isn't an executive committee meeting where motions like that would be entertained. I'm not going to entertain the motion, but speech after speech after speech, how I was abusing the rights of the minority, and somebody that wasn't qualified to be on the Supreme Court was going to come up for a hearing. And they didn't have time to read all the material that needed to be read. And for 6 weeks before our first hearing, they tried to get access to anything that would slow this process up, because they thought they'd take over the Senate in the 2018 election, and they wanted to slow this down and stop this from being done, so that they would do it. And I still get people from Iowa coming up to me almost 2 years later, thanking me for how I conducted those hearings, and it was worth it. So let me just kind of say that once we got by that point, we had the hearing, and then we thought he was on his way to being confirmed. And then, of course, the famous letter come up that from Dr. Ford on sexual harassment. So we had another 3 weeks of back and forth on that. But my goal was to see this through and just be calm and collected and let the process work. And that's what we did. So the only thing that I got criticism before that I didn't appreciate was from Republicans that was saying I wasn't tough enough on the Democrats. They'd speak twice the time that they were limited and everything like that. And I've learned a long time ago, you want to shut somebody up, it takes longer to shut them up than just letting them talk. So we got him on the Supreme Court.
Many Democrats and their allies in the media continue to relentlessly attack Justice Kavanaugh over uncorroborated sexual assault allegations against him as a teenager, yet now seem to have lost their voices or turned into contortionists in defending former Vice President Joe Biden against Tara Reade's much more relevant, serious, specific, corroborated, and credible workplace in the Senate rape and retaliation allegations against Biden when he served as the very powerful Senate Judiciary Chairman. What do you think of this double standard?
Well, it's not for me to make a judgment, but it seems to me like the accusers should be afforded the same respect and opportunity.
You have said before that it is important to have strict constructionists on the bench. Why is it important to have judges who follow the law rather than make it up?
Because of the Constitution. The Constitution provides that people's elected representatives should write the laws, not unelected judges. And you know why that is? Because the electoral part of our government is accountable for its decisions. And if you don't like what Chuck Grassley does or any other member of Congress does, you can vote us out of office. But once you get a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court and you're, besides interpreting law, you're making law and putting your own personal views in there, you got a lifetime appointment. You can't be voted out of office. So and of course, the Constitution doesn't in any way say unelected judges should be writing laws for the in the first place. So strict constructionists keep their legal interpretations and judgments within the confines of the text of the Constitution and statutes passed by Congress. They do what judges are supposed to do. And that preserves our democratic system of government where people that make laws can be thrown out of office, where judges can't be unless they're impeached. It preserves government of the people, by the people, and for the people.
The president has appointed 193 federal judges, as we mentioned earlier. That includes Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh. What does the transformation of the federal judiciary mean long-term for conservatives?
I may be repeating myself a little bit, but it preserves our constitutional system. But let me answer another way. First, it means that we can count on courts to interpret the law as instead of dictating new policies from the bench. And second, it means conservatives have a new duty for maintaining the Constitution as it was originally intended, that judges judge and not legislate. And there is more liberal advocacy than ever. So folks on our side need to continue defending the work of the last few years, and particularly thanking Trump and by re-electing Trump.
You've been a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee since the 1980s, and you've had a front row seat for over 10 Supreme Court hearings. How has the confirmation process changed since you've been in the Senate?
It's escalated very much through partisanship. And I went to the Senate in 1980, so I can only speak since the 1980s, but I think I've studied enough history that you can say that there wasn't filibuster of judges until about the year 2002 or 3. And some people would point to, I forget the name, but somebody named by Johnson to the Supreme Court Chief Justice in the 1960s, late 60s, and they said he was filibustered, but when they finally had a vote on that issue, he didn't even get a majority of the Senate at that time. So you can scrub that off of your list, and I think it's pretty clear no filibusters of Supreme Court justices or even circuit court judges until about the year 2000. So it's been relatively new, and it starts with Democrats deciding that ideological views of judges was a reason to keep them off the bench, as opposed to their temperament and opposed to their qualifications and other things. That's why you get things like Democrats and a few Republicans fighting Bork, or Justice Thomas having a hard time getting on the Supreme Court. But then you turn around and Ginsburg and Breyer gets on because Senator Hatch, chairman of the committee, thought that we had gone too far on this partisanship and we ought to get back to the normal ways of doing things for 200 years. So they get overwhelmingly approved, and then Bush gets elected, and the Democrats figure Bush stole the election, Republicans stole the election, they're going to pay for it, and they're going to filibuster the type of judges Republicans would put on. So we had, besides Bork and Thomas as some examples, Estrada had 7 cloture motions, and he had to withdraw after 7 because he had to make a living. And then we had Schumer's schemes to filibuster nominees, and that happens only rarely before the Bush administration. And I just said it never happened because you use that one example I give you. This came, of course, this all came to a head with Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings, and we've had quite a period of partisan tensions, and it ought to relax, but I don't expect that it will relax.
If Republicans keep the Senate, you plan on retaking the Senate Judiciary Chairmanship. What will be your top priorities?
Well, first of all, a lot depends on whether the president gets reelected and we keep control of the Senate, and you can't take that for granted, but I'm going to continue to prioritize building and maintaining a federal bench of strict constructionist judges, and we'll continue to have this president appoint that type of people to it. And I've always valued congressional oversight. I probably have a better reputation on overseeing enforcement of our laws and the president faithfully executing the laws as the Constitution requires, even more so than what I've done on judgeships. But I want to make sure that we continue strict constructionists, and that and congressional oversight through hearings and investigations will continue to be my priorities, as they've been for the first 4 years I was chairman of that committee.
Here is my last question. How should conservatives, especially those who care about the courts, think about the election this year?
Well, I believe in rallying cries, although I don't think they're used as much as they used to be. But you know how we rallied the patriotism of American people to be Hitler and Tojo and Mussolini in World War II? Remember Pearl Harbor was a cry. So I think for winning this election and controlling the United States Senate, remember the Supreme Court, remember Kavanaugh.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Senator. And for the people on this call, you can learn more about A3P by going to article3project.org. That is article number 3project.org. And please follow us on Twitter at Article 3 Project. That's article number 3 Project. Thanks again for joining us.